I'll pay $50,000 to anyone who can make this baby stop crying." The words, sharp and desperate, sliced through the pressurized tension of the first-class cabin like a shard of glass. They were not shouted, but their quiet intensity held more power than any roar, cutting through the monotonous drone of the engines at 35,000 feet. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and for a suspended moment, everything stood still. Everything, that is, except the baby, whose wails only escalated, her tiny lungs somehow weaponizing desperation into pure, unadulterated chaos. It was supposed to be a routine flight, a seamless 6-hour glide from the frenetic energy of New York to the sun-drenched promise of San Francisco. But somewhere over the jagged peaks of Colorado, Flight 808 had transformed into a crucible. In Seat 1 Ampere, Julian Croft, the billionaire tech mogul whose face was a regular feature on magazine covers celebrating innovation and ruthless efficiency, was publicly and painfully unraveling. Julian was a man who architected his life with the precision of code. His world was one of data points, quarterly earnings, and hostile takeovers managed with a surgeon's calm. He commanded boardrooms with a glance and could predict market fluctuations with an almost psychic certainty. Yet, none of that mattered now. Not the $10,000 bespoke suit that was now damp with a nervous sweat. Not the ludicrously expensive, ergonomically designed baby carrier stowed overhead. Not even the carefully curated public image of America's most eligible widowed father, an image his PR team had spent millions crafting. Because his 9-month-old daughter, Lily, had been crying since the moment the wheels left the tarmac. It was not a simple, fussy cry. It was a primal scream, a relentless siren that tore through the cabin's polite atmosphere, fraying nerves and shredding the last vestiges of civility. For over 3 hours, the sound had become the flight's oppressive soundtrack. He had tried everything: the white noise app on his phone, the organic, Swiss-designed teether, the pre-warmed bottle of imported formula. He had paced the aisle until a flight attendant politely asked him to sit, his long legs awkward in the confined space, his rocking motions jerky and uncertain. He felt the weight of 100 silent judgments. The man in 3B, a hedge fund manager who had loudly discussed a multi-million-dollar deal before takeoff, had thrown a cashmere blanket over his head with an audible groan. A woman in a Chanel scarf and noise-canceling headphones sighed with exaggerated despair, her meticulously plucked eyebrows arched in disdain. Someone, just out of his direct line of sight, muttered, "This is why I don't fly commercial." Each whisper was a physical blow. Julian could weather boardroom ambushes and scathing media reports, but the public shame of failing to soothe his own child felt like a fundamental indictment of his being. He was a fixer, a problem solver. But this problem, this tiny, screaming, red-faced human, was beyond his formidable abilities. He carried Lily as if she were made of delicate porcelain, terrified of breaking her, or worse, of her breaking him. The nanny had quit 2 days ago with a terse text message. His ex-wife had taken their private jet to a yoga retreat in Bali without so much as a phone call. And his personal assistant, in a misguided attempt at good optics, had booked him on a commercial flight. He hated optics. He hated being out of control even more. The child's cries reached a new, piercing crescendo, and it was in that moment of utter defeat, when the silence of the other passengers had become more damning than their complaints, that Julian Croft, a man who believed every problem had a price, made his desperate offer. The silence that followed his words was heavy, thick with shock and a kind of morbid curiosity. Who would dare? Who could possibly succeed? Behind the thin curtain separating the world of champagne and hot towels from the rest of the plane, Serena Vance heard it all. To most, she was invisible, just another part of the aircraft's machinery. Hair pulled back in a severe bun, a navy blue apron tied neatly over her uniform, a name tag clipped on that no one ever bothered to read. She was the kind of person you looked through, not at. Noticed only when your ginger ale was late or your tray table wouldn't lock. But on this day, Serena Vance was more than a server at 35,000 feet. At 27, she had learned more about pressure, patience, and the intricate workings of the human heart than most executives twice her age. She didn't have degrees from Ivy League schools or a portfolio of blue-chip stocks. She had grown up in a small, cramped apartment in East Oakland, where the sirens were a nightly lullaby. Her mother had worked double shifts at a nursing home, until cancer claimed her when Serena was just 16. Her father was a ghost, a recurring character in a story of prison sentences and broken promises. That had left Serena to mother her two younger brothers, one with chronic asthma, the other born 10 weeks premature. By the time she graduated high school, she could swaddle a baby in her sleep, operate a nebulizer with one hand, and calm a screaming toddler with the other. Her dreams of becoming a pediatric therapist were tucked away in the pages of worn, second-hand psychology textbooks she read on her days off, highlighting words she didn't understand, determined to learn them anyway. The airline gig was a temporary measure, a survival tactic. A friend in HR had slipped her the opportunity. Short-term contract, minimum pay, no benefits. But it came with one invaluable perk: free standby flights. It was a ticket to a future she was painstakingly building, one textbook, one shift at a time. As she stood in the relative quiet of the economy galley, the sound of Lily's crying wasn't just noise to her, it was a language she understood intimately. She closed her eyes and listened past the volume, tuning into the rhythm, the pitch, the subtle shifts in tone. This wasn't a cry of hunger or a wet diaper. It was deeper. It was the sound of distress, of a tiny nervous system overwhelmed and overloaded, amplified by the anxious energy radiating from the man holding her. She remembered that sound. She had heard it in the trembling chest of her baby brother, his tiny body racked with grief for a world he had entered too soon. She had spent countless nights just like this, not fighting the noise, but joining it, absorbing it, and transforming it into peace. Something shifted in her chest, a familiar ache, a call to action she couldn't ignore. Her supervisor's words from the morning briefing echoed in her head. Economy staff do not enter the first-class cabin unless specifically requested. But the cry from the front of the plane wasn't a request. It was a summons. She couldn't sit still. Not anymore. By the second hour, the atmosphere in first class had curdled from frustration to fury. Lily was still screaming, her face a blotchy, crimson, tiny fists clenched as if she were fighting the very air she was breathing. Julian looked like a man being slowly flayed in public. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion and humiliation. The man in 3B, the hedge fund manager, leaned into the aisle and addressed the senior flight attendant, his voice a low, sharp hiss. "Isn't there some kind of rule about removing disruptive passengers?" A woman 2 rows back added, her voice dripping with entitlement. "This is first class, not a daycare. We paid for comfort." Another chimed in, not even bothering to whisper. "Some people shouldn't have children if they can't control them." Julian heard every syllable. Each comment was a fresh lash on his already raw nerves. He had built empires from scratch, stared down Wall Street analysts and foreign dignitaries, but nothing had prepared him for the acute, visceral shame of this moment. It was then that the curtain parted. Serena Vance stepped through, carrying nothing but a profound sense of calm. She didn't hesitate. Her steps were measured and quiet, her focus singular. She walked toward seat 1 Ampere, a silent figure moving through a sea of hostile stares. But before she could speak, a man in a crisp blazer leaned toward his seatmate and said, loud enough to land exactly where he intended, "Well, let's see if the help can do better than the billionaire." Serena heard him. She didn't flinch. She had heard worse in her life. Far worse. The words were a reminder of the invisible lines people drew in the world, lines she had to cross every single day. She refused to give them power. She reached Julian, who looked up, startled, his eyes a maelstrom of exhaustion, desperation, and a flicker of deep-seated skepticism. He saw her uniform, her simple appearance, and his mind, conditioned by a lifetime of hierarchy, struggled to compute her presence. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and clear, a calm island in the ocean of noise. "I think I can help." He blinked, a long, slow blink. He saw the doubt reflected in the faces of his fellow passengers. He saw the senior flight attendant hovering, ready to intervene. Trusting this woman, this stranger in an apron, felt like another surrender, another admission of his own inadequacy. But then Lily let out another shuddering, gut-wrenching scream, a sound that broke through his pride and left only raw desperation behind. For a long moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the billionaire's verdict. Julian stared at her, this unknown woman whose quiet confidence seemed utterly out of place in the chaos he inhabited. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, unnerving certainty. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Go ahead," he said, his voice raspy and defeated. Carefully, Serena reached for the baby. Julian's arms tightened for a fraction of a second, a final, instinctual act of possessiveness. But another wail from Lily made him relent, and he carefully transferred his daughter into Serena's arms. The shift was immediate and profound. Where Julian's hold had been stiff and anxious, Serena's was fluid and encompassing. One hand supported Lily's neck with practiced ease, the other cupped the delicate curve of her back. Her movements were not the awkward, learned motions from parenting blogs. They were instinctual, warm, and profoundly human. She didn't shush the baby. She didn't bounce or rock her frantically. She simply adjusted Lily against her shoulder, turning her slightly so the baby's ear rested against her collarbone. And then she began to hum. It was not a melody or a lullaby. It was a low, resonant thrum, more felt than heard, a sound that seemed to vibrate from the very core of her being. It was the sound of absolute calm. The cabin, which had been a cacophony of crying and frustrated sighs, fell utterly silent. Not because Lily had stopped crying yet, but because the atmosphere itself had changed. The sheer force of Serena's stillness commanded the space. Her fingers tapped gently along Lily's spine, not randomly, but with a clear, rhythmic intention. Pressure points, breath patterns. It was a technique her mother had called body listening. It wasn't about silencing a child. It was about joining them in their chaos and leading them out. It was about syncing your energy with theirs, regulating them through calm, not noise. And slowly, miraculously, it worked. Lily's frantic screams softened, tapering off into shuddering hiccups. Her tiny, clenched fists uncurled, her fingers resting against Serena's neck. Her breathing, once ragged and panicked, began to even out, syncing with the low, steady hum vibrating through Serena's body. Within minutes, she was quiet. Her eyes, half closed and heavy, fluttered once before closing completely. Her head nestled against Serena's shoulder, as if it had found its rightful place in the universe. The storm had passed, leaving only a final, shaky exhale. In the first-class cabin, mouths hung open. Eyebrows were raised in disbelief. The man who had complained the loudest cleared his throat and suddenly found the view out his window fascinating. Julian stared, his analytical mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. It defied logic. It defied every expert he had ever paid. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How did you do that?" Serena didn't look at him right away. She was busy whispering something soft and low into Lily's hair, words meant only for the two of them. Then, she calmly met his gaze. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft but clear, "they don't need a bottle, or a new toy, or a 5-point plan. They just need someone who isn't afraid to feel what they feel." No one responded. Not right away. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't flashy or loud. It was something quiet, powerful, and utterly inexplicable. The unthinkable had happened. A problem money couldn't solve had been fixed, and a woman in a service apron had been the one to do it. Julian Croft had never experienced this kind of silence before. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a quiet that felt earned, a peace that had settled like a warm blanket over the entire cabin. He watched Serena gently rock his daughter, her body moving in a subtle, easy rhythm with the hum of the plane. Lily was sound asleep, her small hand clutching a fold in Serena's apron as if it were a lifeline. "How did you know what to do?" Julian asked again, his voice less laced with awe now, and more with a genuine, desperate need to understand. Serena adjusted Lily's blanket before finally meeting his gaze. "My baby brother," she said softly. "He was born 3 months early, tiny. He couldn't sleep for more than an hour without screaming just like that. The doctors gave us charts and routines, but none of it worked." She paused, a flicker of memory in her eyes. "My mom, she figured it out. She used to say, 'You don't calm a baby with your hands, Serena. You calm them with your nervous system.'" Julian blinked. That wasn't a phrase he'd ever heard at Yale or in any boardroom. It sounded both profoundly simple and impossibly complex. Serena continued, her voice low, but steady. "It's called co-regulation. If my body is full of anxiety, the baby feels it and their anxiety skyrockets. But if I'm grounded, if my heart rate is slow and my breathing is deep, they can feel that too. They borrow your calm until they can find their own." Babies don't need more noise. They need presence. Julian exhaled slowly, a long, deflating sound. I have experts, he said, almost to himself, a whole team of them. Pediatricians, sleep consultants, child development specialists. No one ever told me that. Serena offered a small, kind smile that held no trace of pity or triumph. Sometimes the people who get paid to have the answers aren't the ones who've lived through the problem. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked down at Ella, finally at peace, her cheeks no longer blotchy, her breathing soft and even. She never sleeps like that with me, he admitted, the confession costing him more than he would have thought. Serena didn't offer platitudes. She offered truth. You're not doing anything wrong, she said gently. You're just not used to listening in this way. Your world is about fixing things. This isn't about fixing her. It's about meeting her where she island. Julian leaned back in his leather seat, his gaze unfocused. For the first time, in what felt like weeks, maybe months, he wasn't thinking about stock prices or product launches or quarterly reports. He was thinking about connection, real, human connection, and how a complete stranger had just taught him more in 10 minutes than all the books, blogs, and business plans ever had. The cabin lights had dimmed, but for Julian Croft, a light had just been switched on. He studied the woman beside him, his gaze shifting from the analytical lens of a CEO to the searching eyes of a father. Do you mind if I ask, he began carefully, is this your full-time job? Serena gave a small laugh, a genuine, warm sound. Not exactly. I'm usually waitressing at a diner in Oakland. Today was a fill-in shift. They needed someone. I needed the cash. Julian nodded slowly. You're not trained in early childhood development? He asked, though he already knew the answer. No degrees. Not yet, she said, her voice tinged with a quiet determination. I'm taking community college classes part-time, hoping to become a pediatric therapist someday. It's a long road, but I'm moving. He looked at her, and something clicked into place behind his eyes. A series of complex calculations resolving into a single, clear solution. You should be running a childcare institute, he said, half to himself. Their eyes met, not romantically, not dramatically, but honestly. Two people from two completely different worlds, one in designer shoes, one in non-slip soles, who had somehow, in the middle of the sky, found common ground. The peace was short-lived. Just as Serena was gently transferring the sleeping baby back into Julian's now far more capable arms, a sharp voice cut through the calm. Miss Vance, M? A woman in a crisp, impeccably sharp blazer had stepped into the first-class cabin, a clipboard tucked under one arm. It was Mrs. Albright, the flight supervisor. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight, the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter. Serena turned, her posture instinctively tightening. May I speak with you in the galley? Mrs. Albright asked, though it was clearly a command, not a request. Julian glanced from Serena to the supervisor, sensing the immediate shift in temperature. Is everything okay? He asked. Mrs. Albright offered a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. This won't take long, Mr. Croft. Serena followed the supervisor to the back of the plane. The galley was dim and cold, the hum of the engines louder here, a stark contrast to the plush quiet of first class. The moment the door slid shut, the supervisor's professional mask dissolved. What were you thinking? She hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. You are not authorized to enter the first-class cabin unless directly instructed. Your station is economy. You know the protocol. I was trying to help, Serena said, her own voice quiet but firm. That is not your job, Mrs. Albright snapped. Your job is to serve drinks and collect trays. You overstepped. And worse, you handled a VIP passenger's child without clearance. Do you have any idea the kind of liability you exposed this airline to? Serena's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew how this scenario played out. She had been in enough small, cold rooms like this, with someone in a position of power pointing out rules that always seemed to bend for others but remained rigid for her. I didn't think helping a crying baby needed permission, she said softly. It does when that baby belongs to Julian Croft, the supervisor retorted, crossing her arms. A man with a private legal team that could ground this entire fleet. You could have cost us everything. Serena said nothing. She just stared at the polished floor, taking a slow, steadying breath. Then, from behind them, a calm, authoritative voice spoke. She saved my daughter. They both turned. Julian stood at the entrance to the galley, Lily still sleeping peacefully in his arms, his expression unreadable. She didn't just help, he continued, stepping into the small space. She saved the flight from turning into a complete nightmare. She saved me from a public humiliation. And if you think for 1 second that I am going to sit quietly while the one person on this plane who actually solved a problem gets punished for doing her job better than anyone else, you are profoundly mistaken. Mrs. Albright's jaw dropped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. And one more thing, Julian added, his voice dropping to a cool, dangerous level. If one negative mark from this incident appears on her record, my office will be speaking to your corporate legal department first thing tomorrow morning. I'll make sure they understand the value I place on exceptional service. The supervisor's composure shattered. She forced a syrupy sweet smile. Of course, Mr. Croft. A misunderstanding. I'm sure we can clarify things internally. As the woman scurried away, Julian looked at Serena. Are you okay? She nodded slowly, still stunned. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said, his gaze serious. I did. They returned to their seats in silence. A few passengers watched them, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Without hesitation, Serena took the empty seat beside him. After a long moment, Julian spoke, his tone thoughtful. I'm not offering charity, he said, his voice low, but I believe in investing in people who prove they know what they're doing, especially when the world hasn't seen it yet. He paused, letting the words settle. I own a network of early development centers in California. We focus on high emotion, trauma, informed childcare. We've been looking for someone to lead a new pilot program. Until about an hour ago, I didn't know who that person was. Serena's breath caught in her throat. I'm offering you a position, he said plainly. A paid internship to start, full tuition covered at any school you choose, relocation assistance and mentorship from our lead staff, a chance to build the future you've been studying for. She stared at him, speechless. Why me? She finally whispered. Because you did what no one else could, he said. Not just for Lily, for me. I'm offering this because of who you already are. 1 week later, the California sun cast long, golden rays through the wide, floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harmony Child Development Center in San Jose. The air smelled of clean linen, fresh fruit, and the faint, sweet scent of baby powder. Soft, calming music drifted from hidden speakers, mingling with the distant sound of children's laughter. Everything about the space felt warm, safe, and intentional. At 8 a.m. sharp, the glass doors opened, and Serena Vance walked in. There was no apron, no airline name tag, no tray in her hands. She wore a simple, collared blouse, dark jeans, and had a messenger bag slung over her shoulder. Her curls, freed from their tight bun, framed her face, and her eyes, though still deep and knowing, held a new light, the light of possibility. She didn't look like she was walking into her first day at a new job. She looked like she was coming home. The front desk attendant greeted her with a warm smile. You must be Miss Vance. Mr. Croft is expecting you. In the back nursery, a room painted in soft shades of sage and cream, she found him. Julian was standing by a window, bouncing Lily gently in his arms. When he saw Serena, his entire face lit up with a genuine, unguarded smile. You made it, he said. I made it, she replied, her voice steady and sure. He looked down at his daughter. She's been a little fussy this morning. Want to say hi? Serena reached out instinctively. As Lily's eyes widened at the sight of her, a soft, delighted gurgle escaped her lips, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a coo. She remembers you, Julian said, a note of fresh wonder in his voice. Babies remember safety, Serena replied softly, even if they don't have the words for it yet. They stood there for a moment, not boss and employee, not billionaire and waitress, just two people brought together by chaos, now connected by choice. In that quiet room, with the gentle rhythm of a baby's breath between them, the world felt right. Life doesn't always reward the loudest voice or the most impressive title. Sometimes, it rewards the quiet ones, the observers, the listeners. It rewards the courage to step forward when no one else will, not to prove a point, but to answer a need. Serena Vance was never supposed to be in first class, and she certainly wasn't supposed to be the person who made a titan of industry stop, reflect, and grow. But that day, in the sky, a child found comfort, a father found humility, and a woman who had always known her own worth finally had someone else recognize it too. It's a reminder that empathy is not a service reserved for the wealthy, that wisdom doesn't always come with a degree, and that sometimes the person you overlook is the one who holds the answer you've been desperately searching for.